When our power-hungry HOA president brutally tasered my grandfather over unauthorized parking, she had no idea that he was a senior partner at the city's most feared law firm, and would eventually expose a massive real estate conspiracy and take down their entire corrupt board in handcuffs. Before we continue with this story, let us know where you're watching from. Drop a like on the video and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow we've got another crazy story you won't want to miss. The morning sunlight trickled softly through the oak-lined streets of Sunnybrook Estates, making everything look deceptively serene. Just moments before the community descended into chaos, I stood frozen on my front porch, coffee cup suspended mid-sip, watching in disbelief as my grandfather, Theodore Ted Marshall, a respected property law attorney who'd spent half a century mastering tactful negotiation, was being scolded like a child by Peggy Ann Whittaker, the iron-fisted dictator of our homeowners association. Peggy stood stiff-backed and imperious, clipboard clasped like a sacred talisman, her sharp, icy blue eyes narrowed accusingly. "Mr. Marshall," she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness, "Article 37A clearly prohibits planting unauthorized flora. Your azaleas are a direct violation, subjecting you to immediate fines." Grandpa blinked calmly behind his glasses, bewildered but dignified. "Peggy, these azaleas have been here since 1987, long before you moved here." Peggy's jaw tightened. She visibly trembled with suppressed fury, a vein pulsing ominously in her temple. "Rules are rules, Mr. Marshall. No exceptions. You'll hear from my lawyers." I stepped forward, attempting calm diplomacy. "Peggy, this feels excessive." She snapped her head towards me, her painted red lips tightening into a forced smile. "Jacob, darling, let adults handle this." And with that condescending dismissal, she strutted away, heels clicking triumphantly, leaving an atmosphere thick with disbelief and anger. But none of us could have guessed how swiftly this absurd power play would escalate into war. Within days, a neon orange violation sticker decorated our mailbox, a passive-aggressive declaration of Peggy's power. Then came the fines. $20 here, $50 there, absurd infractions scribbled on pastel-colored notes left at ungodly hours. My grandfather's neatly kept hedges were suddenly declared excessively tall, our driveway improperly maintained, and, my personal favorite, our porch swing was unauthorized outdoor furniture. But Peggy's spite didn't stop there. She systematically weaponized neighborhood gossip, whispering lies and innuendos at HOA meetings, turning once friendly neighbors into wary strangers. When Grandpa decided to fight back legally, Peggy doubled down. Her response? An emergency HOA meeting, conveniently scheduled at midnight and attended only by her loyal cronies, passing bylaws faster than anyone could blink. The situation grew ridiculous. Neighborhood kids jokingly called her Queen Peggy behind her back, yet adults silently obeyed, terrified of retaliation. It was the sort of petty tyranny you'd laugh at in disbelief, until you realized you lived there. As frustration mounted, Peggy's obsession with control reached cartoonish levels. She purchased a drone, yes, a drone, to photograph backyards, scanning obsessively for violations. We spotted her one afternoon, dressed head to toe in camouflage like a deranged suburban Rambo, crouching behind hedges and scribbling violations onto her beloved clipboard. One afternoon, as I stood helplessly reading another violation, improper, holiday decor. In July, Grandpa quietly stepped up behind me, placing a steady hand on my shoulder. "Jake, she's spiraling. Trust me, I've seen her type in court. They burn themselves out eventually." But Peggy wasn't the burnout type. She was the burn everything down to win type, which became horrifyingly clear the next day. I was at work when Grandpa called, his usually calm voice tight with disbelief. "She's having your car towed, Jake. Says it's illegally parked." "What?" I nearly shouted, gripping the phone tighter. "It's parked in our driveway." Racing home, I found Peggy overseeing the spectacle, smugly directing a tow truck driver who looked deeply uncomfortable. "You can't do this, Peggy." My voice cracked with frustration. "Oh, sweetie," she smirked, relishing her power. "It's for the community's good. Rules apply to everyone, even spoiled attorneys' grandsons." Then came the moment that changed everything. Grandpa stepped forward calmly, reaching for the clipboard Peggy clung to like a shield. "Peggy, I'd like to review your documentation, please." Her eyes flared in panic, nostrils flaring. "Don't touch me!" Suddenly, without warning, she yanked something small and metallic from her purse. A sharp crack echoed through the neighborhood, and Grandpa crumpled to the ground, stunned and gasping. Peggy stood frozen, taser trembling in her hand, as neighbors rushed outside, their expressions a mixture of horror and disbelief. I was defending myself," she stammered, voice rising to a panicked shriek. "He assaulted me." A chilling silence settled over the street. Grandpa, ever dignified, pushed himself slowly upright, eyes blazing with quiet determination. "You just made a terrible mistake, Peggy," he said, voice calm yet full of iron. "I promise you this isn't over." Peggy's eyes flickered, briefly with fear, then settled into that familiar, arrogant glare. But I saw it, a tiny hairline fracture in her armor. As sirens wailed in the distance, Peggy straightened defiantly, her voice dripping venom. "You have no idea who you're messing with." And just like that, our sleepy neighborhood was officially at war, and Peggy Ann Whittaker, dictator of Sunnybrook Estates, had no idea what she'd unleashed, or the hidden secrets we were about to uncover. In the days following Grandpa's tasering, Sunnybrook became ground zero for Peggy's relentless campaign of intimidation. Instead of backing down, she doubled her patrols, clipboard in hand, eyes blazing with obsessive vigilance. The once friendly neighborhood turned into a twisted suburbia dystopia, neighbors glancing nervously over shoulders, doors locked tight, curtains drawn in paranoia. But Peggy underestimated one crucial detail. My grandfather had been building ironclad property cases since Nixon was president. Together, we methodically began gathering evidence. Photographs of Peggy trespassing, video footage of her drone spying through windows, and stacks of bogus fines she'd obsessively issued. Grandpa always insisted, "Jacob, revenge isn't satisfying. If it's rushed, Peggy's downfall has to be airtight." Yet Peggy's power continued to tighten like a noose around our neighborhood. Any resistance brought immediate retaliation. My next-door neighbor, Maria Gonzalez, received a hefty fine because Peggy determined her garden gnome encouraged loitering. The Johnsons' beloved golden retriever, Rusty, was declared a noise violation and banned outdoors entirely. Each abuse felt simultaneously absurd and infuriating, driving us steadily toward our breaking point. Then, in a calculated display of force, Peggy called another emergency HOA meeting, mandatory attendance, of course. The community clubhouse, typically cheerful with bingo nights and birthday parties, felt more like a kangaroo court. Under harsh fluorescent lights, Peggy presided like a vindictive judge, reading fabricated charges from her clipboard with exaggerated solemnity. "Jacob Marshall," she announced dramatically, her icy eyes gleaming with self-righteous triumph, "stands accused of conspiracy to undermine community harmony." "Excuse me?" I stood up, disbelief etched into my face. Murmurs rippled around the room as Peggy pointed a manicured finger directly at me. "You're trying to sabotage Sunnybrook Estates," she hissed, eyes narrowed theatrically. "I've seen your private meetings, plotting behind closed doors. You're trying to divide us." Grandpa stood up calmly, his voice radiating quiet strength. "Peggy, what exactly is your endgame here?" Her eyes widened slightly, nostrils flaring as she momentarily faltered. "My goal," she snapped quickly, regaining composure, "is protecting Sunnybrook from corruption and chaos." The irony was almost unbearable. Grandpa shook his head slightly, allowing himself a small smile. "Peggy, you're building a house of cards. Be careful. It might collapse." Her lips curled into an arrogant smirk. "Try me, old man." And she meant it. The next day, Grandpa received a cease and desist letter from a law firm we'd never heard of, Paradise Park Development Group. Curious, I started digging. My blood ran cold as pieces fell into place, a string of recently sold properties, astronomical fines forcing neighbors to move, and Peggy's ruthless enforcement suddenly made chilling sense. "Grandpa," I said urgently, handing him printed documents late one evening. "Peggy isn't just power-hungry. She's clearing out Sunnybrook for developers. Paradise Park is buying up properties cheap, then redeveloping the whole neighborhood. He exhaled slowly, jaw clenched tight with righteous fury. Jacob, we have to expose her. This is bigger than petty rules and garden gnomes now. We quietly enlisted neighbors, transforming our house into a clandestine command center, documenting Peggy's every violation. Grandpa meticulously tracked the financial connections, while I covertly filmed Peggy's interactions with shady developers. In coffee shop parking lots, all smug handshakes and whispered deals. Yet Peggy's paranoia made her dangerously unpredictable. Late one night, while reviewing footage, I spotted something chilling. A shadowy figure lurking outside our window, clipboard unmistakable. Before I could react, a brick smashed violently through our living room window, landing with an ominous crunch. Attached was a note, hastily scrawled yet unmistakably Peggy's handwriting. Back off, you're in over your head. Heart pounding, I stared at Grandpa, whose calm facade finally cracked. He leaned forward, voice grave. Jacob, she's desperate. She knows we're onto her. Yet, just when victory seemed within reach, Peggy delivered another shocking blow. The following morning, I opened the door to find police officers grimly waiting, holding an arrest warrant. Jacob Marshall, one officer said coldly, you're under arrest for harassment and criminal trespassing. My head spun as neighbors watched, stunned and confused. Peggy, smugly triumphant, stood nearby, lips pursed into a bitter smirk. You see, Jacob, she called out mockingly, her voice dripping honeyed venom. You should have played nice. But her arrogance was her biggest mistake yet. As handcuffs tightened around my wrists, Grandpa appeared behind her, holding a folder tightly, his eyes cold steel. Oh, Peggy, he whispered, voice firm and certain. You're right. Someone here is definitely in over their head. But it's not us. Peggy's confidence faltered, eyes narrowing suspiciously, and as the squad car door slammed shut, I glimpsed Grandpa's steely resolve. He had discovered something crucial, something Peggy never expected, a hidden secret powerful enough to unravel her twisted empire entirely. I spent that night pacing a bleak holding cell, counting ceiling tiles and picturing Peggy's smug expression. But I knew my grandfather. His silence wasn't defeat. It was preparation. Early next morning, the doors buzzed open and Grandpa stood confidently beside two sharply dressed attorneys from his law firm. Charges dropped, he declared calmly, handing over paperwork as the officer unlocked my cell. Peggy's allegations were bogus, and we have proof. Relief surged through me as Grandpa leaned in, a sly grin tugging at his lips. It's time, Jacob. Today, Peggy learns why you never pick a fight with a lawyer's family. Within hours, news vans crowded Sunnybrook's entrance, microphones, pointed at Grandpa as he calmly laid out the facts. Peggy Whittaker, our seemingly upright HOA dictator, had been conspiring with Paradise Park Development Group, fraudulently fining residents into selling their homes cheaply. With clinical precision, Grandpa provided meticulously prepared documents, recordings of Peggy's illicit meetings, and even drone footage she'd ironically provided herself. The reporters devoured every revelation, buzzing eagerly. Is it true she even assaulted you? One asked. Grandpa flashed a wry smile, adjusting his glasses dramatically. She did indeed. Apparently my azaleas were quite threatening. Peggy arrived mid-sentence, furious and breathless, her perfect makeup smeared by frantic perspiration. She shoved through reporters, clipboard raised defensively like a shield. These allegations are slander, she screeched, eyes darting wildly. I've devoted my life to this community. The crowd erupted in laughter. Peggy recoiled, momentarily confused by this sudden rejection. Gone was the neighborhood's forced respect, replaced with mocking derision. Her carefully cultivated image shattered, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. You're finished, Peggy, Grandpa stated firmly, holding up one final document. And here's the pièce de résistance, a financial agreement between you and Paradise Park, outlining exactly how much profit you'd pocket for forcing us out. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Peggy's eyes widened in horror, desperately, trying to snatch the paper, but Grandpa calmly stepped aside, letting reporters snap pictures. You can't do this, Peggy stammered, voice thin with panic. Oh, Peggy, Grandpa sighed with mock sympathy. Haven't you always insisted that rules must be followed? Peggy's pale face turned crimson with humiliation. She lunged forward, shrieking, "I'll sue every one of you!" but was swiftly blocked by a uniformed officer who placed handcuffs firmly on her wrists. Cameras flashed like fireworks at her panicked struggle, her rule-driven world finally collapsing in a single, humiliating spectacle. The neighbors she'd once oppressed cheered openly, taking photos like they were attending a long-awaited festival. Peggy's reign had ended spectacularly, a fitting finale of irony and poetic justice. Over the following weeks, the fallout was swift and merciless. Paradise Park executives faced criminal charges, and our community sued successfully, gaining compensation that transformed Sunnybrook. Peggy's obsessive rules were abolished overnight, replaced by a fair, transparent HOA led by residents, none of whom carried clipboards. Ironically, Peggy's beloved drones were repurposed as neighborhood security, their blinking lights now a comforting sight rather than Orwellian surveillance. Sunnybrook Estates, once a place of whispered fears and paranoid glances, was transformed into the vibrant, laughter-filled community we'd always envisioned. But the sweetest irony was yet to come. Months later, Grandpa and I visited Peggy, now working community service at a local gardening center. She wore an orange jumpsuit, her carefully manicured nails dirtied from hours spent planting flowers, specifically azaleas. Her face dropped as we approached, lips tightening into a bitter line. Grandpa smiled broadly, a mischievous glint in his eyes. "Peggy, azaleas look lovely on you," he remarked dryly, "although I recall you once found them objectionable." She scowled fiercely, silently shoveling soil with renewed frustration. Grandpa leaned closer, voice low enough for only her to hear. "Remember, rules are rules, no shortcuts." We left her simmering in quiet fury, utterly powerless, a bureaucratic tyrant reduced to planting the very flowers she'd once despised. Sunnybrook blossomed beautifully that spring, vibrant and welcoming, filled with friendly chatter instead of fearful silence. The community held an annual festival celebrating our collective triumph, affectionately dubbed Azalea Day, in honor of Peggy's ironic defeat. Standing proudly beside Grandpa as neighbors gathered cheerfully around us, I couldn't help smiling. "You know, Grandpa," I teased warmly, "I'm starting to think you enjoyed this." He chuckled lightly, adjusting his glasses with practiced grace. "Jacob, there's nothing sweeter than justice, especially when it comes served with irony." And as laughter filled the peaceful, now thriving Sunnybrook Estates, I glanced at the freshly planted azaleas lining our yards, living proof that even dictatorships crumble under the weight of their own absurdity.